I want to tell you about a Tuesday night in October when I was lying in a hospital bed in Columbus, Ohio, with an 4 in my left arm, a blood pressure cuff cycling every 4 minutes, and my phone face up on the blanket in front of me. I had called my mother 15 times. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. Not 3 times. Not 5. 15 calls, made over the span of about 2 hours, from a bed where a nurse had just told me I was going into emergency surgery, and she needed to know if there was anyone I wanted contacted. Not one of those calls was answered. My father's phone went to voicemail on the first ring every time. My mother's rang 4 times and then stopped. 4 rings and then nothing. Not even her voicemail greeting. Just silence and then the soft mechanical sound of a call ending. I put the phone face down on the blanket. I stopped trying. The woman who paid my $4,340 hospital bill that night was named Ruth. I had never met her before in my life. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she'd been sitting in the waiting room for 3 hours waiting for news about her husband's knee surgery. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my parents. She didn't know anything about me except that I was 29 years old and I was handling something alone that no one should have to handle alone. She paid the bill. She left before I could thank her. She left a note folded under the plastic cup on my bedside tray. I didn't read it until the next morning. And when I did, I sat with it for a long time. What happened after, what happened when my parents found out a stranger had done what they hadn't, is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story. Before I go any further, if this is already sitting with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back about 3 years, to a house in a suburb of Columbus and a family that looked, from the outside, like it had everything in order. My parents, Gary and Diane, met at a church retreat in 1987 and built their life together the way a lot of people from their generation did, around appearances, around community standing, around the quiet competition of who had the nicest lawn and whose children were doing the best. They were not cruel people. I want to be careful to say that, because the story I'm about to tell you is not a story about monsters. It's a story about people who had a very specific way of loving, conditional, performance-based, and deeply uncomfortable with need. My mother, Diane, was the kind of woman who always looked put together. Hair done. Good shoes. A casserole ready to take to a neighbor in crisis. She was generous in the ways that were visible. She was good at showing up for other people's emergencies when those emergencies could be witnessed. When they could be talked about at coffee after Sunday service. When there was a role for her to play that came with recognition. My father, Gary, was quieter. More avoidant than cruel. He had a way of leaving the room, literally and figuratively, when anything got difficult. He would hear a hard conversation starting and suddenly remember something he needed to check on in the garage. He deferred to my mother on everything emotional, which meant that his silence was always her endorsement. I have one older brother, Marcus, who was, from as far back as I can remember, their easier child. Not because he was better behaved. Not because he tried harder. But because he was less. He needed less. He asked for less. He cried less. He was less of an inconvenience to the version of parenting they wanted to do, and so he received more of them in return. I was the child who felt things deeply and said so. Who had questions they couldn't answer. Who went through a hard stretch in high school and needed more than they knew how to give. I was the one who made the quiet, unspoken demands on them just by existing the way I existed. And I learned early, the way children always learn early, that need was not welcomed in our house. That asking too much meant receiving less. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had adapted. I had learned to handle things myself. I had learned to call them when I had good news, not when I had bad news. I had learned to perform fine, because fine was what they could receive. Any version of not fine made my mother anxious in a way that circled back to her, and made my father disappear, and left me more alone than if I hadn't said anything at all. So I stopped saying anything at all. And for a few years, it almost worked. We had a functional relationship built on the parts of the truth we could all tolerate. Sunday dinners when I was in town. Phone calls that lasted about 20 minutes and covered safe ground. The illusion of closeness without any of its weight. What I didn't understand then, what I only began to understand that October, was that I had been practicing, for years, for a moment I didn't know was coming. The moment when I would actually need them. And discover, in real time, that practice and reality are entirely different things. I should tell you that the Tuesday night I ended up in the emergency room didn't come out of nowhere. My body had been sending signals for about 3 weeks that I'd been ignoring, the way you do when you're 29 and busy and generally healthy, and you don't want to be the kind of person who runs to the doctor over every twinge. I had been having pain on my lower right side. Not constant. Not unbearable. The kind of pain that shows up and disappears and shows up again, and you think, I'll deal with this on Friday. And then Friday comes and it's better, so you don't. And then it's back on Monday and you think, I'll deal with this next week. About 2 weeks before the hospital, I mentioned it to my mother on the phone. Casually. The way I'd learned to mention things quietly, without urgency, so she wouldn't have to worry. I've been having some side pain, I said. I'm going to look into it. She said, probably just stress. Are you drinking enough water? I said I was. She said, make sure you're eating enough. You always forget to eat when you're busy. And we moved on to talking about Marcus's new apartment. I tell you this not to indict her for that conversation. I tell you this because you need to understand the context. She knew something was going on with my body. It was small, and I'd made it sound small, and she had processed it as small. But it was there. It had been named. It was in the record between us, the way things are in the record even when you don't call it that. 3 weeks later, I was lying on my kitchen floor in Columbus at 8:15 on a Tuesday night, unable to stand up, and I reached for my phone. I want to try to describe what it feels like to have an ovarian cyst rupture, because the physical reality of it matters to what comes next. It doesn't announce itself slowly. It arrives. One moment you are fine, or the version of fine you've been performing, and the next moment there is a pain in your abdomen so sudden and so absolute that your legs stop working. Not metaphorically. My legs stopped holding me up. I sat down hard on the kitchen floor. The fluorescent light above the stove was on. I remember that detail very clearly. I could see the edge of the counter from where I was sitting, and I remember thinking, very practically, that I needed to get to my phone. I got to my phone. My first instinct, and I want you to understand this was instinct, not thought, was to call my mother. Not 911. Not a friend. My mother. Because when your body fails you at 8:15 on a Tuesday night, the first thing the deepest part of you reaches for is the person who is supposed to be your first and safest call. That reflex doesn't care that you're 29. It doesn't care that you've been practicing independence for a decade. It reaches anyway. She didn't answer. I called my father. First ring. Voicemail. I called my mother again. 4 rings. Then nothing. I should have called 911 at that point. I know that. But something in me, something stubborn, something that still believed, kept reaching. I called Marcus. His phone was off. I called my mother again. I called my father again. I called the house line, the number I'd grown up calling, the number I hadn't dialed in years because everyone had a cell phone now. It rang 11 times. I counted them. I was on the kitchen floor in Columbus, Ohio, and it rang 11 times and no one picked up the house phone. I called my mother 3 more times. That's where we get to 15. 15 calls over the course of approximately 40 minutes while I sat on my kitchen floor and the pain moved and changed, and I started to understand that this was not something I was going to manage by drinking water and lying still. I called 911. The dispatcher was calm and professional, and she asked me a series of questions, and I answered all of them, and when she asked if there was a family member she could contact, I said, my parents. But they're not answering. She said, is there anyone else? I thought about it. Not right now, I said. She stayed on the line with me until the ambulance arrived. Her name was Jacqueline. She had a steady voice, and she talked to me about ordinary things between the important questions, where I lived, what I was feeling, whether the pain was getting worse, and I have thought about Jacqueline many times since that night. The way a stranger's steady voice can be the most stabilizing thing in the world when your own body is betraying you. The paramedics were there within 8 minutes. I was in the ambulance in 11. I was in the emergency room at Columbus General by 9:15. I called my mother twice more from the ambulance. My phone was in my hand and the habit was stronger than the evidence. Neither call was answered. At the hospital, they moved quickly. An ultrasound. A CT scan. A doctor, a young woman with dark hair pulled back and the efficient, unsentimental manner of someone who had done this many times, who told me that I had a ruptured ovarian cyst with internal bleeding and I needed surgical intervention, and she needed to know if there was anyone they could contact. I looked at my phone. 15 outgoing calls. 0 responses. Not right now, I said again. For the second time that night. She wrote something in my chart and nodded and told me they were going to prep me for surgery, and I lay back on the table and stared at the ceiling tiles, and there was a particular quality of silence in that moment. Not peaceful, not dramatic, just very clear. Clear in the way that moments are clear when the noise around them finally stops and you see something exactly as it is. I saw it exactly as it was. I put my phone face down on the hospital blanket. I didn't call anyone else. I don't remember much about the 2 hours before surgery. Anesthesia does something to the edges of memory, the period just before it and just after it gets soft and uncertain, like a photograph taken slightly out of focus. What I do remember is the pre-op bay, a curtained area. The sound of other patients, other voices, other people's quiet emergencies happening behind fabric partitions. A nurse named Donna who was kind in the particular way that ER nurses are kind, efficient, and warm at the same time, not an ounce of it wasted. I remember that I was crying. Not loudly. Not the kind of crying that draws attention. Just the kind that leaks out when you've been holding something for long enough that your face stops cooperating. Tears moving down the side of my face toward the pillow and me not doing anything about it because I didn't have the energy to perform fine right now. There was no one there to perform for. I didn't know Ruth had been watching until she appeared at the edge of my curtain. She knocked on the metal pole. An actual knock, a polite one, like she was knocking on a door. I turned my head. She was standing at the gap in the curtain in a blue cardigan, reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck, holding 2 paper cups of water the way people hold things when they need an excuse to approach someone. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm just in the next bay waiting for news about my husband. I could hear that you were." She paused. "I just wanted to ask if there was anything I could get you." I told her I was fine. She looked at me with the particular expression of a woman in her 60s who has watched enough of life to know when fine means fine, and when fine means the opposite of that. "Okay," she said. She didn't push. She just said, "I'll be right over there if you need anything." And she went back to her curtained bay, and I could hear her sit down, and I closed my eyes. I went into surgery at 11:40 p.m. I came out of it at about 2 in the morning. I don't know exactly when Ruth left. She had been waiting for hours for her own news, her husband's knee surgery, routine but long, and at some point she went home. I was in recovery when a nurse brought me a folded piece of paper and said a woman in the waiting area had asked her to give it to me. I didn't read it until morning. I was still foggy and sore, and the light in the recovery room was the pale, institutional gray of very early morning, and I lay there with the folded paper on my chest for a while before I opened it. It was written on the back of a hospital visitor's form, whatever she'd had in her bag. Her handwriting was neat and slightly slanted, the handwriting of a woman who had learned cursive properly and kept the habit. It said, "You called someone. They didn't come. That's not your fault. Feel better, sweetheart. Ruth." And then, below that, in smaller writing, "Your bill has been taken care of. Please don't worry about it." I read it twice. I read it a third time. I folded it back along its creases and held it in both hands and looked at the window and the gray morning light behind it, and I did not perform fine. Not even for myself. I just let myself feel exactly what I felt, which was grateful and devastated in equal measure, and I lay there with Ruth's note in my hands until the breakfast tray arrived. The bill was $4,340. She had paid it in full before she left. I had no way to contact her. She hadn't left a number. Just her name. My parents called the next morning at 9:47. Not because they'd seen my calls. Not because they'd been worried. My cousin Trish had run into Marcus at a gas station, and Marcus had mentioned, in passing, that I'd had some kind of medical emergency, and Trish had called my mother, and that was how they found out. I had been in the hospital for 13 hours by the time my mother's name appeared on my screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. I want to be honest about that, I let it ring twice. Not because I was calculating anything. Just because I needed 2 rings to decide what version of this conversation I was willing to have. I answered. Claire. My mother's voice had that particular quality it got when she was managing her own emotion by pressing it flat. Why didn't you tell us? I said, I called you 15 times, Mom. Silence. We were at your Aunt Carol's, she said. For her birthday dinner. We had the phones in our bags. I said, both of you. It was a dinner, Claire. You know how Carol feels about phones at the table. I lay there in the hospital bed with the breakfast tray in front of me, and I looked at the window, and I thought about Jacqueline, the 911 dispatcher, who had stayed on the phone with me on my kitchen floor and talked to me about ordinary things to keep me calm. I thought about Donna the nurse, who had been efficient and warm at the same time. I thought about Ruth and her reading glasses and her knock on the metal pole. I said, I was in surgery. My father had been on the call the whole time, silent in the background the way he always was. He spoke then. He said, well, you're okay though, right? You handled it. You handled it. There are sentences that land somewhere specific in your chest. That one landed in the exact same spot where the 15 unanswered calls had already settled. I felt it arrive, and I felt it join everything else that was already sitting there. Yes, I said. I handled it. My mother said, we'll come up this weekend. We'll bring food. I said that was fine. And we ended the call. Then I picked up Ruth's note from the bedside tray, and I read it one more time. You called someone. They didn't come. That's not your fault. I folded it back up and put it in the pocket of my hospital bag. I have it still. I left the hospital the following afternoon. A friend of mine, a woman named Petra who I'd known since college, drove me home and stayed the first night, sleeping on my couch without being asked. I did not call my parents to tell them I'd been discharged. They called 2 days later on their way to Carol's to return a dish. The weekend visit they'd offered didn't happen. Something came up. I don't remember what they said came up because I wasn't really listening by then. I thought about Ruth often in those first 2 weeks. I asked the hospital billing department if they could tell me anything about who had processed the payment. The woman I spoke to was apologetic but firm. Patient financial information was private. She couldn't share anything about how a payment was made or by whom. I understood. I thanked her. I thought I might not find her. Then, about 3 weeks after the hospital, I got a message through the church directory. My family had gone to First Methodist in Worthington my whole childhood, and I was still technically in the directory from years ago, a digital remnant of a version of my life I'd mostly moved away from. The message was from a woman named Barbara Kessler, who was a member of the congregation and who was, she explained, a close friend of Ruth Landauer. Ruth Landauer. Now I had a last name. Barbara wrote that Ruth had mentioned the hospital, mentioned paying a bill for a young woman alone in the pre-op bay, and that Barbara had thought of me when she heard it, because she knew my family, knew that I was from Columbus, knew that I was approximately the right age. She was reaching out carefully, she wrote. She didn't want to presume. She just thought perhaps I was the person Ruth had mentioned. I wrote back within 10 minutes. Ruth and I spoke on the phone 4 days later. She had a direct, unhurried way of talking, not warm in a performed way, but warm in the way of a person who is simply not afraid of being kind. She told me her husband's surgery had gone well. She told me she had seen me in the pre-op bay and had understood, from what she observed, that I was alone in a way that was not planned. She did not ask for thanks. She seemed, if anything, slightly uncomfortable when I tried to offer them. You don't need to thank me, she said. I just did what was in front of me to do. I asked her why she'd left the note. There was a pause. You were crying, she said. Not loudly. Just quietly. And you had your phone in your hand and it wasn't ringing, and I thought, another pause. I thought you should know that it wasn't your fault that no one came. Sometimes people need to hear that. I asked her how she'd known no one had come because of something wrong with me. She said, because you apologized to the nurse. You apologized for being in the bay without a family member, like you were causing an inconvenience. I've seen that before. That's not what someone does if they're alone by choice. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. She had seen me more clearly, from the next curtained bay, after 3 hours in a waiting room, than the people who had known me for 29 years. I want to be clear that I did not tell my parents about Ruth. Not right away. Not strategically. I simply didn't. The information belonged to me. The kindness belonged to me. I was not ready to share it. But Ruth was Barbara Kessler's close friend. And Barbara Kessler was a member of First Methodist in Worthington. And First Methodist in Worthington was the church where my parents had attended services for 30 years, where my mother was on the women's committee, where my father had been a deacon, where the entire social architecture of their life was built. I did not tell them about Ruth. But I underestimated how small a community is. It happened at the pace that church communities move, not quickly, but thoroughly. Barbara mentioned to someone that she'd connected me with Ruth. Someone else mentioned to someone else that I'd been in the hospital alone. The detail that a stranger had paid my bill, that detail, that specific and striking detail, moved through the social network of First Methodist Worthington like water finding its level. Quietly. Steadily. Irresistibly. My mother called me on a Wednesday afternoon about 5 weeks after the hospital. She had a different quality in her voice than usual, compressed, careful, the voice she used when she was navigating something she hadn't fully worked out yet. She said, "I heard that someone paid your hospital bill." I said yes. She said, "Someone from the church community." I said, "A friend of Barbara Kessler's, yes." Silence. "Why didn't you tell us that?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about it for a full 3 seconds, which is a long time in a phone conversation, and I decided to tell the truth. I said, "Because I didn't know how to explain why a stranger did something that I'd called you both 15 times hoping you would do." The silence after that was different. Longer. Heavier. The silence of something landing. My mother said, "Claire." I said, "I'm not angry, Mom. I'm really not. I just want you to understand what that night was." She said, "We didn't know it was serious." I said, "I called 15 times." She said, "We didn't know." 15 calls in 2 hours from someone who never calls more than twice, I said. At some point, the number of calls is the information. Another silence. I said, "I don't need an apology right now. I just need you to know what I experienced. I need you to actually know it." She said she needed to go. She would call me later. She didn't call that week. My father called me the following Sunday. Not my mother, my father, which was notable on its own. Gary Whitfield did not make independent phone calls. That was not how their household worked. He called at 11 in the morning, right after church, which meant he had called from the parking lot or from the car before they got home. Away from my mother. Another notable thing. He didn't apologize. I want to be accurate about this. He did not say the words "I'm sorry." What he said was quieter than that, and in some ways more significant. He said, "Carol Benson asked your mother about you this morning. After service. Asked if you were doing all right." Carol Benson was one of my mother's closest friends in the congregation. Had been for 20 years. I said, "What did Mom say?" He said, "She said you were fine." I said, "Okay." He said, "And then Carol said she'd heard you were in the hospital alone. And she asked." He stopped. "She asked if we'd been out of town." I let that sit. He said, "Your mother was very quiet on the drive home." I understood what he was doing. He was not apologizing. He was telling me that the world had noticed. He was telling me, in the only language he had available, that the absence had consequences that extended beyond me. That it had been seen. That there was a record of it now in the community they'd built their lives around, and that record was not in their favor. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "She paid a lot of money." I said, "She did." He said, "We would have," and then he stopped again. I waited. He didn't finish the sentence. I don't think he could finish the sentence honestly, and he knew it, and to his credit, he didn't finish it dishonestly. I said, "I know, Dad." We talked for about 3 more minutes about nothing in particular, and then we said goodbye. It was not a resolution. But it was the first conversation with my father in my adult life that felt like it had something real in it. Something unperformed. that he was sitting in a parking lot after church, calling me separately, because something had shifted, something in him, or something around him, or both, and he didn't know what to do with it yet. In the weeks after that call, small things changed. Carol Benson's daughter, who was about my age, sent me a message saying she'd heard I'd had a rough fall and hoped I was recovering well. A woman from my mother's committee brought food to my parents' house and specifically asked how their daughter in Columbus was doing. My cousin Trish, who had been the one to relay the news to my parents in the first place, called me directly for the first time in years and said, with a frankness I hadn't expected from her, "I heard what happened. I'm glad you're okay. And I'm glad someone was there." None of these were dramatic. None of them were confrontations. They were small, specific recalibrations, the way a community quietly adjusts its understanding of people when new information arrives. My parents were not cast out. They were not publicly condemned. But the story was known, and the story told its own verdict, and they felt it. And I felt them feeling it, which was its own thing to sit with. My mother came to Columbus in December. Alone, not with my father, which was the third notable thing in a series of notable things. She brought food, the way she'd promised weeks earlier. She sat at my kitchen table across from me, and we had the kind of tea and small talk that we'd been having for years, the surface conversation, the performed normalcy, and then she stopped and set her mug down and looked at me in a way she very rarely looked at me. Like, she was actually looking at me. She said, "I've thought about that night a lot." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't have a good answer. I know you're not asking for one. But I want you to know I've thought about it." I said, "Okay." She said, she stopped. "I think we got used to you being fine. You were always fine. You always managed. And I think we used that as a reason not to." She stopped again. "I don't know how to finish that." I said, "As a reason not to check." She looked at me. I said, "You used my confidence as permission to be absent. And I let you. Because I learned a long time ago that need wasn't welcome, so I stopped showing it. I got very good at being fine. And it worked for a long time until it didn't." She was quiet. I said, "I'm not asking you to be a different person, Mom. I'm too old to wait for that, and I think you're too old to promise it. But I needed you to understand what that night was. Not the medical part. The part where I called you 15 times. She said, "I understand it." I said, "Do you understand that I stopped calling at 15? That I didn't call 16? That something in me made a decision at call 15 that it was time to stop reaching for you and start reaching for someone else." She didn't answer immediately. She picked up her mug and held it with both hands and looked at the table. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Claire. Not I'm sorry you felt that way. Not I'm sorry it happened. I'm sorry." 2 words, clean, without qualification. I nodded. I let it land where it landed. I didn't perform forgiveness, and I didn't perform indifference. I just sat with it. We talked for another 2 hours. Not about the hospital, not about Ruth, not about any of it, about ordinary things, my work, her committee, a book she'd been reading. But the conversation had a different texture than it had before. Something had been named between us. Something that had been present for 29 years and never spoken was finally in the room, and we were both sitting with it. It wasn't a resolution. I want to be honest about that. One conversation doesn't undo the architecture of a lifetime. But it was a beginning of something, or maybe the end of something. I'm still not entirely sure which. Maybe both. Ruth and I exchange Christmas cards now. That's the shape of our relationship, warm, occasional, not more than it is. She sent me a card that first December with a note asking how I was doing, and I sent one back, and we've kept that up for 3 years running. There is something right about that. Something that doesn't need to be more than it is. My parents and I have a different relationship than we had before the hospital. Not a transformed one. I don't want to tell you a story where one hard conversation fixes 29 years of pattern, because that's not how it works and you know that. But something is different. My mother calls me now when she knows I'm going through something difficult, not always, not perfectly, but more than before. My father sent me a text when I had a bad week at work last spring, just, "Thinking of you. Hope the week gets better." He has never done that before in his life. I stared at it for a while. Marcus remains largely unchanged. He asked me once about the hospital, about a year after it happened. He said, "I heard you had kind of a rough night." And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Yeah, my phone was off." And that was the end of it. Some people have further to travel than others. I have made my peace with where Marcus is on that journey. The thing that changed most is not my relationship with my parents. It's my relationship with myself. I stopped performing fine. Not entirely, I'm still myself, I still lean toward managing things quietly. But I have a different relationship with the phone in my pocket now. I know who I would call. Not 15 attempts into the unknown, but the first call, the right call, made from the kitchen floor if I ever end up there again. Petra, who stayed on my couch without being asked. My friend James, who drove 4 hours when something happened with a family member last year just to sit with me for an afternoon. My neighbor Gail, who has a key to my apartment and checks in without being prompted. A small, specific, reliable circle of people who have demonstrated, through small actions and large ones, that they will pick up. That circle didn't come from a dramatic reckoning. It came from paying attention. From watching who showed up and who didn't, over years, and making quiet adjustments. From understanding that chosen proximity is worth more than obligated distance. Ruth was the first person who showed me that clearly. She had no obligation to me. She sat in the next bay and listened and made a decision with what was in front of her. That's all. It sounds simple. In practice, it is one of the hardest things a person can do because it requires seeing someone else's situation as real, as mattering, as worthy of action, without any personal reward attached. She saw it. She acted. She didn't wait to be asked. I think about that when I'm deciding whether to show up for the people in my life. I think about what it would mean to be the Ruth in someone else's story. To knock on the pole. To not need thanks. To do what is in front of you to do. There is a piece of paper in the pocket of a bag that lives on the top shelf of my closet. It's been there for 3 years. The fold lines are soft now, worn from how many times I opened and closed it in those first weeks. It says, "You called someone. They didn't come. That's not your fault." I have read those words more times than I can count. Not because I need the reassurance anymore, or not only because of that, but because they remind me of something I didn't know how to name before that night. That the absence of the people who were supposed to come is not evidence of your unworthiness. It is evidence of their limitation. And those are two entirely different things, even when they feel the same in the dark. I spent a long time confusing them. I spent a long time believing that if I were somehow more, somehow easier, somehow less needing, less feeling, less of an inconvenience, the phone would ring back. I performed fine for years trying to make that math work. It doesn't work. It was never going to work. Because the problem was never me. If you are someone who has reached for a person and found silence, if you have pressed the call button 15 times or 5 times or twice and heard nothing, I want you to hear what Ruth told me from the next curtain bay, with the curtain between us. It's not your fault. The people who don't come are showing you something real. Let them show you. Take the information. And then, slowly, carefully, start building the circle of people who do. They exist. I promise you they do. Sometimes they're sitting 3 feet away in a hospital waiting room, reading glasses on a chain, holding 2 paper cups of water, looking for a reason to knock. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story moved you or reminded you of something true about yourself, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And if you know someone who is quietly handling something alone right now, someone who has learned to perform fine, share this with them. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read them. I read all of them. I'll see you in the next one.